now I would like you to take out your social studies book, Heritage Studies, and we're going to just review a little bit about Jamestown. By the way, boys and girls, if you have the DVD, Pocahontas takes place during the founding of Jamestown. It's a Walt Disney cartoon, but you can get a little familiar with the lifestyle of the Indians. And Pocahontas was a real Indian princess, and she did meet John Smith, but we'll read that she didn't marry Captain John Smith. On page 130, we see a woodland Native American, and he's looking at the ships that are coming in, and these ships, of course, will be moving inland and setting up the town of Jamestown, which was named after King James, and the river is the James River, also named after their king. Of course, the American Indians who lived there did not call it the James River. They probably had their own Indian name for it, but when the English came and took over, they were the boss. Now, looking at page 130 again, we see the ships in the distance. They're the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. And there is the Indian looking out on the shoreline. Remember, I told you yesterday that I want you to make a comparison of what the Indian looks like as compared to the Englishman. Remember, this is in the 1600s, so this is 400 years ago. Notice the clothing. Now, this was all leather, made from maybe deer skin. Notice the clothing that the Englishman wore. Perhaps his boots were made out of leather. Look at the headdress. Look at the face. The color of the skin. The Indian, did he have a beard? No, he didn't. But anyway, you were supposed to make a little outline of the differences between the two men. Remember, I don't have a social studies activities workbook for you, so anything that I give you, you need to do. All right, if you remember from yesterday, we found out that Chief Powhatan was the leader of the Woodland people. The Woodland people were the Native Americans that the men on the ships found that lived here. And Chief Powhatan was very much concerned that these Englishmen had come. They were strangers. If you look on page 131, a lot of the Indian tribes did not want these men to be here. Some of the tribes were friendly, some weren't. So the chief wasn't sure about what to think about them. Now, the only reason why I think he let the English people stay, it says here, the Englishmen had guns and copper and beads, and Chief Powhatan wanted these things. All right, now I want to read a little bit of the background about Powhatan. A picture of Powhatan on page 131 that you see there is how an artist views him. Now, John Smith was a captain of one of the ships, and he drew a picture of what he could of what Powhatan looked like. And the picture was made in 1612, which showed basically what he looked like. And Chief Powhatan was almost 60 years old when he met the colonists from Jamestown. Even though he was older, because he lived out in the woods and he kept himself in good shape hunting and fishing and being with nature, he was powerful and strong and able to do hard work. And he was over 6 feet tall. And we have records that tell how big he was. Now, at that time, the European men were not that tall. But when you know that these Native Americans lived out in nature and they did not have the diseases that the Englishmen had because of the way they lived. The Indians lived out in the fresh air, not these crowded cities where disease can travel like what we have now going on today. The Indians had fresh vegetables and fresh meat from their hunting and their fishing. So they were tall and robust and healthy. Powhatan was the most important chief of Virginia's Powhatan Indians. The Woodland people respected and honored and obeyed him. And he had a lot of military power. I mean, if he wanted to fight, he could get a bunch of Indians together and he could bring about 30 tribes together if he needed to have them. And these tribes would bring furs and corn and other valuables to Powhatan to show that Powhatan was their strong leader. And Powhatan and his warriors could easily have taken over the small number of sickly colonists, because remember, they weren't doing too well. And I think we mentioned that there were about 150 people that came aboard the 3 ships, including the sailors. So the colonists were really greatly outnumbered. Now, the bow and arrow, you would think, was probably not as good a weapon as the rifle. But remember, those rifles did really not have bullets. They had like pellets, and you had to constantly fill up the rifle in order to shoot. Whereas 1, 2, 3, you could get a bow and arrow and kill somebody. So it was so much more efficient than the Englishmen's rifles. But eventually, he began to trust them, and he even allowed his daughter, Pocahontas, to marry an Englishman named John Rolfe. She didn't marry Captain John Smith. She married John Rolfe, and she even went to England, and I believe that's where she lived and raised her family. She did save Captain John Smith's life, but he wasn't the one she finally married. So God used Powhatan and his people to supply food to these colonists in Jamestown, and he allowed Jamestown to survive and become the first lasting English settlement in the New World. Okay, so if you have that video about Pocahontas, of course it's a little off as far as history is concerned, as far as maybe what happened, but you can see what life was like, as I said before. If we turn to page 132, we're going to read how the settlement got started. As I mentioned before, the men had to build a fort as protection because they didn't know if the Indians were going to be friendly or not. And they had to make a plan. And the plan might have looked like this map that is over here. So what they did was they had to make some kind of a fence going around and making a fort. So they made a fort by, first of all, they had to clear the trees, and they removed the large rocks. Now, then they built the walls from the tall tree trunks, and of course that would be a protection. They built a church, a storehouse, houses, and the church was built so that the men could get together every day, read their Bible, pray, and hear preaching. So we know that this settlement was basically a settlement of Christian men. And we're going to be looking at how things were built. It says the leaders of Jamestown made a plan. They would build a fort, and the fort would keep them safe. They cut the trees to clear the land, and the trees were used for the walls of the fort. The fort was built in the shape of a triangle. Houses, buildings, and a church were built inside. Jamestown Fort became the first English settlement, and a settlement is a group of people living in a new place. Now, when people later on, maybe 100 or so years later, started to investigate what Jamestown might have looked like, they were able to find this artifact, which was an axe head. Now, the axe head is made out of some kind of metal, and the handle, if it was made out of wood, probably deteriorated or rotted, and it was no longer able to survive the hundreds of years being buried. So we're going to look at this fort on the top of page 133, and we're going to kind of build a fort here. I'd like you to look at this. This is their plan that they planned first, and we're going to do this plan. Then what they had to do was cut down the trees, and then putting up the fence of the fort, the walls. And you could see, remember the story that we read about Daniel Boone? The way the trees are set up, and points from the one end of the tree have been made so that in case they were being attacked and the Indians or whoever it was would climb over, those pointed parts of the wall would injure them, okay? So that's very much the way Daniel Boone's fort looked like when we read that story. Okay, we're going to look at this fort, and we're going to see how it started to get built. All right, now, as I said, they had to set up. So one of the first things that we had to do was, let me get my little guys together. Okay. So we're going to have a tent over here. Then we're going to have a church over here, because the church was also a meeting place. Then we're going to have Then we're going to have some houses on either side of the church. These are our houses. Most importantly, let's look at this. This is kind of a high tower. This is where they had their cannons. And the cannons would face in two different directions, because in case they were attacked from one side, or they would have a cannon to protect them. Here we go here. All right, and then we would have our houses. And you see pictures of the houses on the first page of the chapter. Okay. Okay. Let's get some room here for these houses. All right, that's how basically the fort looked. Okay. No one living today, of course, saw Jamestown being built. We know what Jamestown looks like because people have gone in the area and dug into the ground and found parts of the fort. These people made pictures of what they found, and the artist kind of drew what it looked like 400 years ago. And remember, anything that was picked up, for example, like this axe head, would be considered an artifact. You know, those are things that were left by people who lived in the area earlier. Okay, so that is basically how the fort came to be. Okay, and you can see that the title of the map, of course, is the Jamestown Fort. If you look at the key, we know that the brown line represents the fence or the fort wall, and the tent is the gray triangle, and the houses are the tan, and of course the gold cross is the church. Okay, so that is basically what the fort looked like, and we have a picture of it. And here we have the words of George Percy. He was one of the men who settled in Jamestown. And it says, the 15th of June, we had built and finished our fort, which was triangle-wise. So here we have an actual written document by someone who actually helped build that fort. Okay, so he lived 400 years ago, over 400 years ago, and we have proof that that was there. Okay, all right, tomorrow we're going to go to how it was living in the settlement and some of the needs and wants of these early Jamestown residents.